I have carried a heavy secret for over 50 years. My story isn't easy to tell, but as the years dwindle and memories weigh more heavily than ever, I feel I must unburden my soul. What you are about to hear is a confession, one of love, betrayal, and a lifetime of regret. I share it in the hope that someone, somewhere, might find a lesson or a shred of wisdom in my mistakes. Breathe. My name is Eleanor, and I am 72 years old. For decades, I've lived with a guilt that has quietly eaten away at my heart. Every night I lie awake, next to nothing but my own remorse, wishing I could turn back the clock. This is the story of how I betrayed the man I loved, and how not a day goes by that I don't ache to tell him I'm sorry. I met my husband John in the summer of 1966. I was a bright-eyed 20-year-old working at the local diner just outside of Baltimore, and he was a charming young man fresh out of boot camp. I still remember the first time I saw him in his crisp uniform, shyly asking if the seat at the counter was taken. He had a smile that could light up a whole room, and an earnest manner that made me feel safe. We spent that summer falling deeply in love. By the time the leaves turned gold, John asked me to marry him. He even serenaded me off-key at the diner after closing time. It was sweet and silly, and of course, I said yes. Those early days of marriage were full of youthful hope. We rented a tiny apartment and furnished it with hand-me-downs and big dreams. At night, we would lie in bed, whispering about our future. Whisper. Imagining the house we'd buy, the children we'd have, and how we'd grow old together. I believed in that future with all my heart. But the shadow of the Vietnam War loomed over us. In 1967, less than a year after our wedding, John received orders to deploy to Vietnam. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he told me. He tried to be brave for my sake, promising it would be only for a short while. I clung to him and sobbed, terrified of what might happen to the man I loved. We spent his last night before deployment holding each other in the dark, saying very little. When morning came, I went with him to the train station for his departure. I stood on the platform wrapped in his arms, trying to memorize everything about him. His scent, his warmth, the sound of his heartbeat. The whistle blew and my heart lurched. "I'll be back before you know it," he whispered, wiping my tears gently. I nodded and forced a brave smile, but inside, I was breaking. As the train pulled away, I waved until I couldn't see him anymore, tears blurring my vision until he was gone. Life as a soldier's wife was a lonely battle of its own. I threw myself into routine to fill the void. By day, I waitressed at the diner, and each night I wrote letters to John. Those letters became my lifeline. I poured my heart onto every page, hoping my words would somehow bridge the distance between us. When a reply finally arrived weeks later, I tore it open with trembling hands. John's words were full of love and longing, though I could sense the weariness behind them. "I miss you so much, Ellie," one letter read. "Some nights, I lie under the stars and pretend I'm back home on that old quilt with you beside me." Reading his letter, I pressed the paper to my heart and imagined I could feel him there with me. But as the months dragged on, the war only intensified. Every night, the evening news brought reports of fierce battles and lists of the fallen. I held my breath through each broadcast, praying I wouldn't hear John's name. Each time, I was relieved. I whispered a thank you to God, then felt guilty knowing so many others weren't so fortunate. I saw other wives in town get the worst news and collapse in grief, and I would think, please, not John. Don't let that be us. I was grateful he was still alive, but I also began to feel a tiny spark of resentment. He was off defending our country, and I was proud of him, yet I was also so terribly alone. That loneliness and fear gnawed at me. and I was ashamed that a part of me resented the very duty that kept him away. I tried to snuff out those dark feelings, but they kept growing in the shadows of my heart. Around that time, Mark, a neighbor a few years older than me, who had been exempted from the draft due to a childhood illness, started checking in on me, helping with little chores and making sure I was managing. His kindness became a small light in my darkness. Sometimes on warm evenings we sat on my porch with a cold drink, talking about anything but the war. I laughed at his jokes and found myself smiling more in those moments than I had in months. I told myself it was innocent, just two lonely people finding a bit of comfort in friendship. Then one stormy night in late August, after I'd received news that John's tour might be extended, I broke down in despair. Rain was pouring outside as I stood by the window, tears streaming down my face. Mark saw the lights on and came over to check on me. He found me on the verge of collapse, sobbing by the window. Without a word, he wrapped me in his arms to comfort me. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. In the blur of heartache and longing, one thing led to another, and we ended up entangled in an intimacy that never should have happened. A betrayal of everything I was trying to hold on to. The very second it was over, a wave of guilt and horror crashed over me. I pushed myself away from Mark, my voice breaking as I begged him to leave. Once he was gone, I sank onto the floor, wrapping myself in a blanket of shame as I realized what I had done. I felt sick with guilt, disgusted with myself. I wanted to pretend it never happened. For a few weeks, I succeeded. Or so I thought. I avoided Mark aside from polite nods across the street. I threw myself even more desperately into writing to John, pouring apologies into words I never actually wrote out, trying to convince myself that one moment of weakness didn't have to define me. I vowed that when John came home, I would be the loving, faithful wife he deserved, and this terrible secret would stay buried forever. Autumn arrived, and with it, whispers that the war might end soon, or that troops would return home. I clung to those rumors like a lifeline. I prayed every night, please just send him home to me safely. I swear I'll make everything right. My guilt and fear grew with each passing day. I cleaned the house endlessly, as if scrubbing floors could also scrub my conscience. I rehearsed smiles and normalcy in the mirror, determined to hide any trace of the pain and shame inside me. In October 1968, the knock on my door finally came. Not the dreaded knock of tragedy, but the sound of hope. I opened the door to find John standing there on the porch, duffel bag at his feet. He had come home without warning, wanting to surprise me. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen. Then joy and relief collided inside me, and I threw myself into his arms. He dropped his bag and held me tight as I sobbed into his shoulder, laughter and crying all mingled together. You're home, I kept repeating, my fingers gripping the back of his jacket. I'm here, Ellie, I'm home, he whispered into my hair. That night, for the first time in over a year, I fell asleep beside my husband, wrapped in the warmth I had ached for. I remember lying there in the dark, his arms around me, thinking, it's over. I have a second chance. I can be happy again. I breathed in his scent, listened to his soft breathing, and for a little while, I felt peace. But reality has a cruel way of catching up. In the light of day, I found myself on edge. The secret between us weighed on me like a stone. I prayed silently that it would stay hidden, that Mark would keep his distance, and that life could go back to the way it was before. For a few days, it almost did. John was adjusting to civilian life, and I busied myself doting on him, cooking his favorite meals, laughing at his jokes. We even talked about maybe taking a belated honeymoon trip. To anyone else, we must have looked like a picture-perfect couple. reunited and happy. Yet John had always been perceptive. Perhaps it was his training as a military police officer, or simply the intuition that comes from loving someone deeply. He began to notice the cracks in my smiles. I caught him studying me at odd moments, a slight furrow in his brow. I was not the carefree girl I'd been when he left, and I'm sure he could sense the tension I tried desperately to hide. One evening, about a week after his return, the unspoken strain finally broke to the surface. We were having dinner, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, a welcome home meal I knew he loved. I was chattering on about mundane things, trying to fill the silence, and John was unusually quiet. Halfway through the meal, he put down his fork and asked softly, "Ellie, is there something you need to tell me?" My heart slammed against my ribcage. "Well, what do you mean?" I stammered, attempting a smile. His eyes met mine with a sorrowful, searching look. You seem different," he said carefully. "And the way you tensed up when we ran into Mark the other day. I'm not blind, Ellie. I feel like there's something you're not telling me." A cold wave of panic washed over me. He knew. Maybe not the details, but on some level he knew. I could have lied in that moment. I could have concocted a dozen excuses. But the weary hurt in his eyes cut through me. He deserved the truth, no matter how much it would destroy us both. I swallowed hard, my throat painfully dry. Tears began spilling down my cheeks. "John, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't finish the sentence, but my face must have told him everything. He drew in a sharp breath, eyes closing as a tear of his own slipped out. "How long?" he asked, his voice tight and low, as if forced from his chest. Shame burned through me. My whole body was trembling. It was just once," I stammered, tears spilling down my face. "I was lonely. I thought I'd lost you. I never wanted to hurt you." John closed his eyes for a long moment, a tear tracing down his cheek. When he opened them, the light in his eyes had dimmed to a dull hurt. "Our trust is broken, Ellie," he said quietly. His words stabbed into me. I wanted to throw myself at his feet and beg forgiveness, but I was frozen by the gravity of what I had done. "I'm sorry," I choked out, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, John." I reached across the table, desperate to touch his hand, but he drew back as if my touch might burn him. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair away. In a shattered voice, he said, "All those nights over there, all I thought about was coming home to you. You were my light in that darkness." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw him truly cry. Not out of relief or pain from war, but out of heartbreak. Seeing those tears, knowing I caused them, was unbearable. I stood too, almost knocking over my chair, and moved toward him. "Please," I begged, reaching for him. "Please, I love you. It was a mistake, the worst mistake of my life. If I could take it back, I would. Please forgive me." I was sobbing, words tumbling out in a plea, my vision blurred with tears. John looked at me, and in his eyes I saw devastation and something like disbelief. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and shook his head slowly. "I can't do this, Ellie," he murmured. His voice was drained, empty. He turned and walked into the living room. I followed, fear jolting through me. He was picking up his duffel bag, the same bag I had been so happy to see him drop at the door just days before. My panic broke loose. I grabbed his arm. "John, don't go," I cried, holding onto his sleeve. "Stay, yell at me if you want, hate me if you need to, but please, don't walk away." I was begging shamelessly, willing to endure anything if he would just not leave. He closed his eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. Gently, he pried my fingers off his arm. "I have to," he whispered. His voice was soft, but each word fell like a hammer. I need time, Ellie. I can't look at you right now." The raw pain in his tone made me flinch. He opened the front door and stepped out into the chill autumn night. I stood in the doorway, the cold air hitting my face, watching as he walked to his car. He didn't drive off immediately. Through my tears, I could see him sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, shoulders shaking. He was crying. I almost ran to him, but something in me knew it was useless in that moment. After what felt like an eternity, he started the engine. The car disappeared down the dark road, its red taillights fading into nothing. I closed the door and slumped against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. A wail rose up from the depths of my soul, an ugly, animal sound of grief that I couldn't contain. I cried until I was gasping, until my body had no strength and my face was soaked. In the span of a week, I had been given back everything I ever wanted, and then I destroyed it with my own actions. The weeks that followed were agony. John stayed at his parents'. Every morning I woke with a pit in my stomach, remembering he was gone. I tried calling once, but his mother gently told me he wasn't ready to talk. I spent the holidays alone in our apartment, clinging to a frail hope that he might come back, but he never did. In January, he sent a brief letter about closing our joint bank account and said he'd collect his belongings when I was at work. True to his word, one day I returned home to find his clothes and personal items gone, and our house key left on the kitchen table. Not long after, we quietly finalized our divorce. To the world, I wasn't a widow, but in my heart, I felt like one. A war widow of my own making because I had driven away the man I loved. In the years that followed, I drifted through life under the shadow of guilt. I moved to a different town, trying to escape the memories. I never remarried. How could I, after knowing what I'd lost? I kept to myself, letting the days blur into decades. I heard through a mutual friend that John eventually moved to Florida and started a family. I was glad he found happiness, but it only underscored the ache of what I'd thrown away. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape my regret. I volunteered with veterans groups and donated to military families, trying to atone in small ways, but nothing could silence that inner voice of remorse. Before I knew it, more than 50 years had passed since that fateful day. Here I am now, in the quiet winter of my life, with so many yesterdays and so few tomorrows. The year is 2025, and I often find myself lost in memories. Sometimes I still half expect to see a young soldier with a cheeky grin walk through my door and call out, "Ellie, I'm home." Of course, that's just an old woman's daydream. John and I haven't spoken since our divorce, a silence nearly as old as I am now. But I have never stopped loving him, and I have never forgiven myself. Not long ago, I had a health scare, a small heart episode that landed me in the hospital. I'm all right now, but that brush with mortality shook something loose in me. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized I might not have all the time in the world to make amends. I thought about John, about the lifetime of pain I'd caused and endured. I knew then that I had to do the one thing I'd been too afraid and too ashamed to do for half a century: reach out to him and apologize. Once I was home, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of stationery and stared at it for a long time. How do you pour 50 years of remorse into a letter? How do you ask forgiveness from someone you hurt so deeply so long ago? My hand shook as I started to write. I told him everything I'd held in my heart all these years, how not a day passed without me regretting my mistake, how I understood if he never wanted to hear from me again, but I needed him to know that I was truly sorry. I told him that he had been the love of my life, even if I didn't deserve to say that anymore. I wrote and revised for hours, tears blurring the ink more than once. In the end, it was a humble, heartfelt plea for forgiveness and a hope that life had treated him well. I wasn't even sure if the address I had for him was current, but I sent the letter off to Florida and prayed it would reach him. Weeks went by. I tried not to get my hopes up. I knew the chances of a reply were slim. But one crisp autumn morning, I opened my mailbox to find an envelope with a return address I knew by heart. My hands practically fell open in a tremble as I pulled out the letter inside. Inside was a short letter in John's familiar handwriting. "Dear Ellie," it began. He said he was surprised but glad to hear from me after so many years. He told me he had made a good life for himself, with a family of his own. And then, with the gentle kindness I remembered so well, John offered me something I had craved for half a century: forgiveness. "I forgave you long ago," he wrote. "Life is too short to hold on to hate. We were young, and war makes us all a little crazy. I've had a good life, and I truly hope you have too. Please don't spend the rest of your days punishing yourself. You always had a good heart. I wish you peace. John." I must have read that paragraph over and over until my tears blurred the ink. He had forgiven me. In my darkest moments, I had imagined him hating me forever, cursing my name whenever he remembered me. But he didn't. He had let go of the anger long ago and moved on to find some happiness of his own. I cried, oh how I cried, tears of relief, of gratitude, of decades worth of pent-up sorrow finally breaking free. I wrote back to him, a shorter letter this time, thanking him for the grace he'd shown me. We exchanged a few letters after that. They were polite, kind letters, catching up on the basic facts of life, our health, the weather, both of us careful and respectful, as if we tacitly agreed not to dig up too many ghosts. We didn't speak of the past beyond that initial apology and forgiveness. There was an unspoken understanding that what happened was finally laid to rest. We never did meet in person again. At our age, living in different states, it simply didn't happen, and that's all right. The closure those letters gave was more than I ever thought I'd get. Knowing he doesn't hate me, knowing he went on to have a good life, it lifted a weight from my chest that I had carried for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Sometimes, I still sit by the window with a cup of tea and reread his letters. I also keep a box of our old mementos, John's early love letters, our wedding photo, little souvenirs of a life that once was. I'll spread them out on the coffee table and let the memories wash over me, the sweet along with the bitter. There's a particular letter he wrote from Vietnam in 1967, where he called me his guiding star in the dark. I cry every time I read that line, even now, but they are gentler tears than they used to be. They're the kind of tears that feel like both sorrow and solace. If I could speak to that 22-year-old me, or to anyone listening who finds themselves lost in loneliness or regret, I would say hold on. Stay true to those you love. Don't let temporary despair make you destroy something irreplaceable. I made that mistake, and I've lived with the consequences my entire life. In the end, my story is one of heartbreak and hard lessons, but also of the unexpected mercy of forgiveness. John found it in his heart to forgive me, even though we could never go back to what we once had. Now I am trying in my own late way to forgive myself. Perhaps the hardest journey of all. As I finish this confession, I feel both drained and relieved. The truth is out, and with it, I hope my heart can finally find some rest. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story of love and loss, of mistakes and mercy. If you take anything from this, let it be to cherish what truly matters and to seek forgiveness from others and from yourself. After all, life is too short to do otherwise.